Committee come to order. Before we start, I wanted to notice to every member that you'll find in your desk drawer, in addition to a seating chart of the members of the committee, a chart of all the staff on both sides of the aisle. It's just been one of those things that's always driven me nuts over the last 20 years, is not knowing who all these people are that work for us and keeping up with them as they change. So that'll be in your desk drawer. Without objection, the chair may declare the hearing in recess at any point, so ordered. A few housekeeping matters before we begin. First, we will adjourn the public portion of this hearing at 12:30 today and immediately move upstairs for the classified portion. Second, I want to welcome back to the committee Mr. Vesey after his brief hiatus. Glad that you remembered where we were. And finally, after consultation with the minority, I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Clyde of Georgia, a member of the Appropriations Committee, be allowed to question witnesses in today's hearing without objection, so ordered. Last Friday, we observed the one-year anniversary of Putin's illegal and brutal invasion of Ukraine. The American people have responded with extraordinary support for the Ukrainians. Millions of Americans have donated their time and money to charitable organizations helping the Ukrainian people. Some have even volunteered to fight alongside the Ukrainian Defense Forces. Congress has responded by appropriating over $100 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and our NATO allies. To date, the administration has distributed over $75 billion of that money, including $46 billion in security assistance. These are unprecedented numbers, and it requires an unprecedented level of oversight by this committee and by Congress. We're up to the task. Last year, Chairman Smith started monthly classified briefings with the administration officials that have continued into the new majority. Many of us have traveled to Ukraine and surrounding countries to witness firsthand the train and equip mission. We've made classified information on the situation in Ukraine available to all members, and our staff have constantly been constantly being briefed with the latest developments by the department. But today is the first time the committee of the House is holding an open public hearing on the matter. I've asked the Inspector General and the Undersecretary to appear today because it is imperative that the American people understand, A, where our security system is going, B, how it's being used, C, and what protections are in place to ensure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. But oversight is about more than just accounting. It's about ensuring the administration is setting strategic goals and implementing a policy to achieve them. That's why we all are here with very real concerns. Since the beginning, the President has been overly worried, in my view, that giving Ukraine what it needs to win would be too escalatory. This hesitation has only prolonged the war and driven up the cost in terms of dollars and lives. This conflict must end, and the President must be willing to do what it takes to end it with victory. Continued reluctance and indecision only empowers Putin, and it sends the wrong signals to President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party. And with that, I yield to my friend and colleague, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I welcome our witnesses as well, and really thank you for the work you've done. You've all appeared before us in classified settings to update us on a very regular basis on the effort in Ukraine. We appreciate the cooperative relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch on this matter. And more than anything, we appreciate your leadership in supporting Ukraine so effectively over the course of the last year. I think it's hard to really imagine the massive undertaking that has been done in the last year since Russia made its decision to invade, and really since in the weeks and to some degree months before the invasion, when we came to realize from our intelligence community that this was going to happen. First of all, we were about the only country in the world that thought it was going to happen. Even the Ukrainians themselves, right up literally to the day of the invasion, thought that we were exaggerating the intelligence and that this wasn't actually going to happen. So from pretty much a dead stop, the Biden administration had to pull together a massive coalition to do something that almost all of the countries involved in that coalition had never contemplated doing and certainly had hoped they would never have to do. And we've done that with a remarkable outcome. The way that coalition was pulled together and the forces that have been given and the weapons that have been given to Ukraine to enable them to be as successful as they have been, combined, of course, with their unbelievable courage and tenacity, is really a remarkable accomplishment. And I think we need to understand it in that perspective. Obviously, we would like the Ukraine to win tomorrow, Russia to be completely pushed out. But I think we also have to be realistic about the challenge that we faced and how we've gone about meeting that challenge, and really how effective we've been in doing that. Now, the purpose of this hearing specifically is on oversight. I think we have had a lot of oversight on this effort from the very beginning. And that is part of the reason why the effort has been so successful. There are constant efforts to sort of spin stories, primarily coming from Russian propaganda, about corruption and weapon systems going where they're not supposed to be. But people who have looked at this, and I know the chairman has done this in great detail, have found that there is no instance of that happening. We have seen the effectiveness. And the best evidence of this, clearly and unequivocally, is the fact that the Ukrainians have been as successful on the battlefield as they have been. If the weapons and equipment and support that we were sending them was being sent elsewhere or stolen or misused, they would have lost a long time ago. Because I think one of the other things that we forget here is even us in the U.S., we saw the war coming, we supported Ukraine, but even us, along with everybody else, thought the Ukrainians didn't stand a chance. We thought that the Russians would be in Kyiv in a week or two, a month at the most. So the fact that they've been as successful as they have been is the best evidence we have that these systems and support that we're sending them is being as well used as it possibly can. And I do want to touch upon the point that the chairman made about how the administration hasn't been quick enough. You know, one of the things that we've heard, not just from critics of the war who don't want to support it, but even from people who do support it, is that there can't be a blank check. That's been sort of the criticism that you take if you want to sort of make it sound like you're still with Ukraine, but you want to be responsible. And I think that's appropriate, okay? But no blank check means no blank check. It means we don't just send everything that people ask for in the blink of an eye without even thinking about it, okay? We think about it and we get the Ukrainians what they really need. And I'm going to go ahead and hit upon one of those examples because I think this is a really good example of the problem, and that is the F-16, which everyone has become obsessed over here in recent weeks. We have considered that request, and I've had many conversations with the witnesses before us and with the DOD as well. And the honest truth is the cost of trying to get the F-16 up and ready to operate in Ukraine, even if we basically said there's nothing more important than that one weapon system and spent all of our time and all of our resources on doing it, best case scenario, we could maybe get some operational F-16s into Ukraine within a year, maybe 8 months if we really pushed it. And this is getting lucky, all right? Because you don't just have to train the pilots. You have to train the mechanics. You have to have airfields that can accommodate the F-16. And you have to have the spare parts to make it work. So we looked at that and we determined that is not a wise use of the resources that are necessary to win the fight. That's what no blank check means. You don't just send it without thinking about it. We thought about it and reached a very intelligent conclusion that this is not the right system. And oh, by the way, a fourth-generation fighter in this particular fight is going to struggle to survive. There are isolated circumstances where the Ukrainians have been able to use the MiG-29s that they have, very isolated, because it's a fourth-generation fighter in the face of a ton of air defense. What we are getting the Ukrainians is those air defense systems that they desperately need to survive right now, and the artillery and the HIMARS and the weapon systems that they do need. So the administration is doing exactly what it needs to do, getting equipment as quickly and as responsibly as possible to make this work. And I also want to make everybody aware of the fact the Russians are fighting a massive information campaign. Yes, they're fighting on the battlefield, and I'll look forward to hearing more details about that today, but they are also trying to break the coalition. You know, the Russian military has performed incredibly poorly. The Ukrainians have performed incredibly heroically, and the war is not going the way that Putin wanted it to, but he is not giving up. And he knows his only hope is to break the coalition that is trying to support Ukraine. And they're trying to do that in a variety of different ways. I mean, you can see all the different arguments about how, well, NATO really started this because of NATO expansion and a whole lot of other nonsense arguments that are circulating out there. But the other part of the way they're doing it is any break in the coalition they see, they're poking and they're prodding. okay? They want to undermine the Biden administration. So while we have constructive criticism of what's going on, let's make sure that that criticism is constructive and we maintain our unity. And I know it is very, very difficult for the folks on the other side of the aisle to say anything positive about the Biden administration. But part of holding this coalition together is to acknowledge the incredible job that has been done in the last year and to maintain that unity and to not jump at every shiny object that seems to be criticism of the Biden administration, like the F-16. Right now, and I've asked this question, we are getting every single weapon system that we can to Ukraine. There is not a decision being made about that might be escalatory. It's about what can we get to them? How can we maintain the support? We've spent a lot of money. There is not a limitless amount of money or a limitless amount of equipment. So I think those decisions are being made wisely. I look forward to this hearing. I think it's perfectly appropriate that we have aggressive oversight, as we've had since the beginning. And that's part of the reason why we've been as successful to date as we have been. With that, I yield back. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
I thank the ranking member. I now want to introduce our witnesses. The Honorable Colin Kahl is the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Dr. Kahl has been the primary official overseeing the DoD's response to Ukraine. The Honorable Dr. Robert Storch is the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. Together with the IGs of the State Department and USAID, his office is carrying out audits and investigations of the assistance we are providing to Ukraine. And Lieutenant General Doug Sims is the Director of Operations for the Joint Staff. He assists the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs in developing and providing operational guidance on Ukraine and other military operations. I welcome the witnesses. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your preparation. I know this takes a lot of effort to get ready for these hearings, and it is appreciated and helpful. Dr. Kahl, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, it's a real honor to appear before you today alongside my good friend, Lieutenant General D.A. Sims over there, and Dr. Storch, our department's Inspector General. I want to begin by expressing the unwavering support of the Department of Defense for Ukraine's sovereignty and security in the face of Russia's unprovoked and brutal invasion. I know that support is shared by and is enabled by Congress and the American people. So I want to thank you for your crucial and continued help to get Ukraine the military capabilities and other types of assistance that it needs to remain in the fight. Thank you, too, for holding this important hearing at this pivotal time for the security of Ukraine, of Europe, and of the world. As we mark 1 year since Russia's further invasion of Ukraine, it's clear that Russia has failed to achieve any of its objectives. Its military is paying tremendous costs. Ukraine remains united and determined to expel Russia's invading forces from its territory. And NATO unity is stronger now than it has been in decades. We are seeing intense fighting in eastern Ukraine as Russia seeks points to exploit and Ukraine defends tenaciously. What happens in the coming months may prove decisive, and we are focused on providing Ukraine with the capabilities it needs right now to defend its people and its territory and change the dynamics on the front lines. I'd like to take a few minutes to lay out our priority capabilities, the ones we're providing to Ukraine now and in the coming days, weeks, and months. First, we have focused on a layered, integrated approach to air defense to counter Russia's attacks on population centers and civilian infrastructure. The Patriot capability from the United States, as well as that provided by Germany and the Netherlands, will give Ukraine advanced long-range capability. These are complemented by medium and short-range capabilities provided by the United States, as well as our allies and partners. Second, we continue to work with allies and partners to deliver a steady flow of artillery rounds and other ammunition so Ukraine can sustain its fight. Third, to enhance Ukraine's ability to maneuver, the United States will provide Abrams main battle tanks, the best tanks in the world. The UK has also committed Challenger tanks, and other European states will provide Leopard tanks. These main battle tanks are complemented by other vital armor capabilities from the United States, including Bradleys and Stryker fighting vehicles, and other fighting vehicles from our European partners. Finally, we have expanded U.S.-led collective training to enable the Ukrainians to better integrate fires and maneuver. Our assistance to Ukraine is possible thanks to the tremendous bipartisan support from Congress. As you know, we have now provided $31.7 billion in support since Russia launched its further invasion of Ukraine a year ago, and our allies and partners have now provided over $19 billion in addition to what we've done. The Department of Defense appreciates the most recent additional Supplemental Appropriations Act which provided presidential drawdown authority, funding for the military services to replace items sent to Ukraine, and funding for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, or USAI. Even as we focus on getting Ukraine what it needs, we've always prioritized accountability, and Ukraine has too. We have adapted our accountability practices for the combat environment to address the risk of illicit diversion, using mechanisms that go above and beyond our standard practices. 1 year ago, Russia launched its brutal invasion to destroy Ukraine as a free and sovereign nation, threatening European security, transatlantic unity, and the security of the world. Today, an independent, sovereign, democratic Ukraine endures. The incredible people in the armed forces of Ukraine remain unbowed and unbroken, and NATO and the wider community of democracies around the world is stronger than ever. The stakes for our national security remain significant. We are determined to support Ukraine's fight against tyranny and oppression, and in doing so, to defend the American interests and values that are so clearly at stake. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kahl. I'd like to recognize General Sims now for 5 minutes to summarize his statement.
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I appreciate today's opportunity to update you on the U.S. military efforts to help the Ukrainian people in their continued fight against the Russian invasion. Today marks the 369th day since Russian forces invaded and began their illegal and unprovoked large-scale invasion of Ukraine. As we meet today, the current situation between Ukraine and Russia is generally static, with both sides employing heavy amounts of artillery, resulting in minimal changes of territory and significant numbers of casualties. In our follow-on session, I'm prepared to discuss particulars of Ukrainian disposition, but generally, and as you've seen reported in open sources, the most active portion of the battlefield today is around the town of Bakhmut. As I have briefed before, over the past 2 months, the Russian army, with assistance of private military contractor Wagner Group, has fought savagely to defeat Ukraine's defenses, employing extreme amounts of artillery and waves of thousands of partially trained, mobilized soldiers and personnel contracted from prisons. The Russians have made incremental gains at significant cost. Ultimately, as I have described before, the fighting has replicated the conditions of the First World War. Key to changing this paradigm is creating a Ukrainian armed forces capable of breaking this state of fighting. In this regard, since I last updated this committee, the concentration of U.S. effort has been focused on combining equipment and munitions with people and training. The intent and efforts of the U.S. military are designed to generate combat-credible forces capable of combining fire and movement to achieve maneuver and increase the overall capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces. Importantly, this training effort is not solely the work of the U.S. armed forces, but is a cohesive approach with our allies and partners. Collective training is ongoing throughout Europe and is dramatically increasing Ukrainian combined arms organizations. All told, since January, the U.S. military has trained another 1,000 Ukrainians, bringing the total trained by the United States to just over 4,000. As I speak, Ukrainians are training in multiple locations in Europe, working with U.S. service members and military trainers from our allies and partners. Key to our ability to conduct collaborative training has been the recent increase in maneuver-related equipment. The U.S. provision of Bradley fighting vehicles, Strykers, and Paladin howitzers, combined with similar fighting vehicles and tank contributions from our partners, is notably increasing the capability of the Ukrainian armed forces. In addition, the U.S. continues to supply critical munitions and individual equipment, from howitzer ammunition to medical and cold weather gear. Finally, and critically important to Ukraine's ability to continue to defeat Russian efforts to destroy civilian infrastructure, U.S. armed forces will soon complete the training and equipping of Ukraine's first Patriot battery. As you know, our air defense experts are providing key training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. We are confident the Ukrainians will employ Patriots with the same expertise they are demonstrating every day with their current air defense capabilities. Thank you for what this committee and this Congress have done and continue to do to provide oversight and resources in support of Ukraine as they continue to fight against the illegal and unprovoked large-scale invasion. While the Ukrainians bear the real burdens of this war, your support and that of the American people has had a profound impact on Ukraine's future. I look forward to your questions and discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Mr. Storch, you're recognized.
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to appear today to discuss the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General's comprehensive independent oversight of U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, as well as our active participation in a whole-of-government approach to ensuring robust oversight of the full range of American assistance. During the year following the 2022 Russian invasion, the DoD OIG completed 4 Ukraine-related oversight projects, with a 5th report released just yesterday. We currently have some 20 ongoing and planned audits and evaluations that are focused on, among other things, ensuring that tax dollars are used properly, that there's appropriate accountability for weapons and other material, and that U.S. stocks are appropriately replenished so they're available should they be needed elsewhere. Additionally, the DoD OIG's Defense Criminal Investigative Service is actively engaged in conducting fraud prevention and investigative activities that play a critical role in ensuring the integrity of U.S. assistance to Ukraine. The DoD OIG currently has more than 90 professionals engaged in oversight of security assistance to Ukraine. In 2022, we issued 2 management advisories that identified several areas of concern that could directly impact the DoD's ability to transparently track and report the supplemental appropriations for Ukraine. Earlier this year, we initiated an audit examining DoD's execution of funds appropriated to assist Ukraine. We have long been focused on end-use monitoring, known as EUM, and enhanced end-use monitoring, or EEUM, the DoD's tracking of how our country's partners employ military assistance and sensitive equipment after those assets are transferred to them. As early as 2020, we issued a report on how the DoD was conducting EEUM of military assistance to Ukraine. In October 2022, we published a classified report that identified challenges DoD personnel responsible for EUM and EEUM face when there are limited or no U.S. personnel present, and the actions the DoD was taking to address those issues in Ukraine. As the situation on the ground has continued to evolve, we recently initiated our 3rd evaluation on EEUM in Ukraine, and we will continue to focus on this important area. Yesterday, we publicly released our most recent report related to the Ukraine effort, making recommendations to assist the Army with its maintenance, inventory, and other processes for pre-positioned equipment in the region. In addition to the topics above, our ongoing and planned projects cover the waterfront of American security assistance to Ukraine, addressing critical issues like the replenishment of U.S. stocks, intelligence sharing, security control for the transport of weapons and equipment, their maintenance and sustainment, awards of non-competitive contracts, and the training of Ukrainian armed forces. And as noted at the outset, DCIS agents are drawing on their experience around the world to conduct outreach and investigations to help prevent and address fraud or other criminal conduct. We are not conducting this oversight alone. We are partnering closely with the Department of State OIG and the U.S. Agency for International Development OIG and many others across the oversight community in a coordinated approach to ensure comprehensive oversight of all U.S. assistance to Ukraine. Along with our oversight partners, the DoD OIG established and leads the Ukraine Oversight Interagency Working Group, which brings together 20 oversight entities in a whole-of-government approach. Just last month, my office and the state and USAID OIGs, in coordination with the larger working group, published our Joint Strategic Oversight Plan, which publicly describes our completed and ongoing work. As detailed in the plan, we are employing the proven model that has been used for years to ensure comprehensive oversight of overseas contingency operations, and we will work together in this effort for as long as the conflict and the need for oversight continue. At the end of January, I traveled with the leaders of the state and USAID OIGs to Germany, Poland, and into Ukraine in order to obtain the latest on-the-ground perspective, to build on our coordinated approach, and to deliver an unambiguous message to American and, in Kyiv, high-level Ukrainian officials about the expectations for accountability for U.S. assistance. The trip made clear that the situation is fluid and calls for continuous, agile oversight. The DoD OIG, working hand in glove with our oversight partners, will continue to make independent oversight of assistance to Ukraine a matter of the highest priority, and we will continue to keep the Congress and the public informed about our work. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Storch. Before we move into questions, I wanted to remind everybody that The maps that you have in front of you, while they're unclassified, we haven't been given permission by the department yet to distribute them beyond the committee, so I'd ask you to leave those here when you leave. And I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Kahl, if Russia were to be successful in taking control of Ukraine, what would that portend for a potential of China taking an effort at Taiwan?
Well, Mr. Chairman, we've seen what a world looks like when revisionist authoritarian powers go on the march and they're unchecked by the free world and they carve out spheres of influence by gobbling up their neighbors. That world was the 1930s, and it culminated in the worst human tragedy in history, the Second World War.
So it would enhance the likelihood that could happen.
I think if Russia is successful in Ukraine or is seen as successful in Ukraine, it will embolden other aggressors elsewhere to do similar things.
That's my point. Chair now yields the balance of his time to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde.
I thank Chairman Rogers for his invitation to be here today and for yielding me his time to discuss this important matter of oversight of U.S. military support to Ukraine. As we all know, the United States has authorized over $100 billion in aid, to which our government holds a responsibility to the American people that it be used for its true, just, and intended purpose. It is the responsibility of Congress to ensure that every single penny of American taxpayer money is being effectively used as intended to assist the Ukrainian people in their fight against Russian aggression. Just 2 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of joining the chairman to visit several of our NATO allies in Europe to receive an update on the war effort in Ukraine and the ongoing oversight work directly related to U.S. military aid. Accountability of the weapons shipped in is absolutely paramount, especially the most sensitive weapons, to ensure that they are being used for their intended purpose and not diverted for nefarious purpose. As a supply officer with both multiple peacetime deployments and multiple combat deployments in my 28 years of Navy service, I am fully aware of the challenges of maintaining visibility and control of critical military hardware and components when the supply lines are long and the theater is kinetic. So, Mr. Storch, I would like to start with you as the Department of Defense Inspector General. In all your inspections and oversight, in country and out, have you found any instances of sensitive weapons like Stinger missiles being either lost or diverted to those not authorized to have them?
Thank you very much for the question. I'm obviously not at liberty to talk about any investigations, but we have not substantiated any such instances, no, sir.
So you can confidently say that to your knowledge, every sensitive weapon is currently under control of those who should have them.
Well, thank you very much for the question. That's why we're engaged in we're laser focused on this issue and engaged in robust oversight to make sure that's the case. We're doing audits and evaluations that look at the weapons from the time they begin at the port while they're transferred throughout as they get to the transshipment points and then they go into the country. And then, as I mentioned in my statement, we're now conducting our third evaluation of the EUM, and with regard to the sensitive assets, the EEUM, the enhanced monitoring, to ensure that the Department of Defense is conducting that monitoring in a robust way. Additionally, as I mentioned, we have the DCIS, the Defense Criminal Investigation Service. They have vast experience all over the world in doing investigations arising out of conflict situations. And so, again, we're very much alert to any instances where that sort of conduct would occur.
Okay. All right, moving on. As I understand it, your office is currently working on, among other things, an audit of DoD award and administration of non-competitively awarded contracts in support of Ukraine. Has there been any waste, fraud, or abuse uncovered or reported to your office in these investigations?
So I appreciate the question. I want to be careful and not get out ahead of my skis because the audit is ongoing.
Okay.
So we are looking at those issues in our audit, and we'll report out on what we find. But the purpose of the audit is to ensure that the DoD has the controls in place to make sure that doesn't happen.
According to your testimony, you said that there were some posters, both in Ukrainian and English, the language, sent out about a particular hotline that people could call if they wanted to report something. So without compromising any identities, have any whistleblowers come forward with information using that particular method of reporting, to your knowledge?
So thank you for referencing the hotline. It's something we worked closely on with our partners
I read
from
your
state and
testimony.
USAID. And the goal is to provide an avenue for people to report what they think may be wrong. We have gotten all sorts of types of allegations over that, and we're continuing to look at them.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, for the record, I would like to submit an article from USA Today, and it says, U.S. has spent billions in Ukraine war aid, but is that money landing in corrupt pockets? It was updated as of yesterday, February the 27th.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
I think the gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you
Chair
very much.
now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kahl, I want to follow up a little bit on what Chairman Rogers was asking about in terms of the policy behind this. As the Undersecretary for Policy, you seem like the appropriate person to ask that question to. This policy is not without risk. I think we all know that. First of all, it is costing an enormous amount of money in terms of tens of billions of dollars. We are also acutely aware of the fact that we do not want to get into a direct conflict with Russia, and we don't want NATO to get into a direct conflict with Russia. But can you state for us clearly why you still believe this is the correct policy to support Ukraine in this war, what the implications are for our own national security? Because I think it's a legitimate question, the American taxpayer, why are we spending money? It seems like a long way away, and not to be overly crass about it, but a lot of constituents ask the question, what's all this got to do with me? I think the policy is sound, but I want to give you the opportunity to say, here's why this matters to U.S. national security.
Well, thank you. Look, I think the entire international system is grounded on the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's at the heart of the UN, and that may sound kind of wonky, except that the entire rules-based order that undergirds is what ultimately minimizes the number of international conflicts and wars that we see. If countries like Russia are allowed to go on the march to swallow up their neighbors, if might makes right, if the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must, then the rule of law will be replaced with the rule of the jungle. And we will live in a very dangerous world. And I'll just give you one example. If you're sitting in Tehran or in Pyongyang or in Beijing, and you're contemplating aggression against a neighbor, and in all those circumstances that's conceivable, you're going to ask yourself, what would be the reaction of the international community? And had the international community stood by, had the United States not exercised its leadership to rally not only the democracies in Europe and North America, but countries around the world to Ukraine's aid, the lesson that dictators in other countries would take is that aggression won't be punished, and that it pays. And that would make the world a much more dangerous place for Americans.
I think it's very well stated. And I think one other argument to make in this is a lot of people who are concerned about this point to our policy in Iraq. And certainly there were a ton of mistakes made there. But the thing that a lot of people forget is on your point of sovereignty, what kicked that whole thing out was Saddam Hussein trying to take over Kuwait and then setting his eyes on Saudi Arabia. Now, how we handled that is highly debatable. In terms of the long term, both what we did in '91, what we did in 2003, but the principle of sovereignty and the principle of exactly what you just stated, not allowing a country like Russia or China to think that they can simply grab territory by force, is core to our own security and to the security of the world long term. And as we speak, we are very aware of the Taiwan situation with China. But China, and I haven't added up the number of countries, but it's more than a half dozen, have sovereign territory now that China, to one degree or another, claims. And if, just like Russia says that Ukraine shouldn't exist, they should be part of Russia, China has the same argument in land that's currently controlled by Vietnam, by the Philippines, by Japan, by India, all across the world. It kicks off a very, very dangerous situation if President Putin is successful in Ukraine. And I think we need to remember that, even while we are aware of the cost and while we're aware of the necessity of making sure that we check where this money is going, which, as Mr. Storch outlined, I think we're doing. But the policy itself is really crucial to peace and stability in the world and ultimately to our own national security in the United States. None of that makes it easy. We all want peace in Ukraine as quickly as possible. But right now, as has been stated clearly, that the path to peace in Ukraine is simple. Putin can stop his war and take his troops out of sovereign Ukraine. And that stops the war in the blink of an eye. But until that happens, we have to support Ukraine to force Putin to that choice. So I appreciate you articulating that, and I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Mike Rogers and Ranking Member Adam Smith, for this very important bipartisan hearing on the issues of Ukraine and immediately the effect that it has on the Chinese Communist Party. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I believe the world is in a global competition between democracies with rule of law opposed by authoritarians with rule of gun. Today's conflict is war criminal Putin's mass murder in Ukraine. This, I believe, if Ukraine must be victorious to deter the Chinese Communist Party from attacking the 24 million people of Taiwan, Ukraine must be victorious to stop Iran from its efforts to vaporize Israel as it develops intercontinental ballistic missiles to devastate American families. With that, Mr. Storch, there have been billions in U.S. weaponry and financial aid flowing to Ukraine and more coming to stop a war criminal Putin. We're all concerned about accountability, and the American people need to know, because somehow this hadn't been recognized, and that is that in all of the legislation that's passed to provide for funding, there have been 39 provisions that provide for reports to be provided to Congress on oversight and accountability. And with that, what is the DOD Inspector General's plan, and what are the broader coordination with the State Department IG, USAID IG, and other relevant IGs? What's the structure to protect the American taxpayer?
Thank you very much for the question. We are actively engaged on an ongoing basis with the state OIG, the USAID OIG, and all of our partners in the working group in ensuring comprehensive oversight over all aspects of assistance to Ukraine. Obviously, my office, the DoD OIG, has primary responsibility with regard to the security assistance, and we have, as we speak, approximately 20 ongoing and planned audits and evaluations that cover every aspect of that security assistance, including the broad range that I mentioned in my statement. We're also working with our partners to make sure that there aren't any gaps with regard to the different types of assistance that are being provided. We're reporting out transparently. We did the Joint Strategic Oversight Plan that I mentioned, and we're going to continue to report out. We have a report coming at the beginning of April under the NDAA that will be providing an update on our work, and we're going to continue to update the JSOP and our other work so this Congress and the American public are fully informed regarding our oversight efforts. It's on us to ensure that there's appropriate oversight across the board to ensure that taxpayer dollars are being spent appropriately and the equipment is being used as intended.
And thank you so much for what you do, but please let's get this publicized so American people can trust what the expenditures are. Dr. Kahl, I am really concerned about foreign military sales, delivery to Ukraine, delivery to Taiwan. And our allies are making the best of their ability to provide. And then, for example, we're providing 31 Abrams tanks. Somehow the media presented that we would not have any tanks in the future. They leave out that we have 8,000 tanks, Abrams tanks. We potentially have 22,000, actually, Abrams tanks. But the 31 was presented as just debilitating the United States. We can do better. And so what's being done, particularly working with Chairman Mike Rogers and others, to have an expedited foreign military sales, it's absurd with prepositioning of equipment when we hear that it may take a year to get equipment to Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Congressman. As you know, we predominantly use two sets of authorities at DoD to get Ukraine weapons. PDA, Presidential Drawdown, which allows us to draw from stocks, and then USAI, which allows us to put things on contract. When we draw things out of stocks, things generally arrive in Ukraine within days or a handful of weeks. When we put things on contract, it depends. Sometimes it's weeks, sometimes it's a handful of months, sometimes it is longer than that. So it really depends on which authority we are using, but we have surged a tremendous amount of security assistance into Ukraine, more than $31.7 billion in a year. I don't know that there's any historical precedent for that. The vast majority of that has come out of our stocks and has come very rapidly. I'll just say I share your frustration with the broader foreign military sales process. We are getting after that problem through a Tiger team at the Department of Defense that has identified, I think, about 80 process improvements that can streamline these things. It's still too slow.
Hey.
And all I would say is that there's nothing, as we draw things down from our stocks, that is making the FMS problem worse. It's kind of an apples and oranges issue, because FMS is more aligned with the USAI authority in terms of putting things on contract.
We need to follow the example of the Czech Republic and then last week Poland, providing equipment immediately. Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, now I recognize gentleman, Mr. Courtney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to begin by recognizing both your efforts and Ranking Member Smith's efforts to hold recurring updates and briefings by this committee. And in my opinion, it has been that healthy process which has provided the foundation for the bipartisan votes that have passed supplemental funding really over the last year. And again, the witnesses have been part of that process, so thank you for your contribution. Just to, footstomp what I think my friend Mr. Wilson just indicated is that included in those supplemental funding bills were actually specific explicit language by Congress directed towards the offices of Inspector General to be engaged at the maximum level. And again, Mr. Storch, if you could just sort of confirm that for the record, that, again, you've been around for a long time, thank goodness, but again, it also has been with congressional support that your efforts are taking place.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for the question. We very much appreciate that support, and we're committed to the greatest possible transparency in our oversight efforts.
So, and again, when we talk about a blank check, I mean, I think clearly we in the Congress had our eyes wide open when these large amounts of funding were authorized and appropriated, that we wanted oversight at every step of the way. In dealing with, again, Ukraine's efforts to deal with waste, fraud, and abuse, Dr. Kahl, there's an international organization which kind of keeps score on countries' efforts in terms of dealing with corruption and fraud, and it's Transparency International. In the last year, at the same time that this unprecedented almost infusion of money has been flowing in, not just from the US, but also from the EU, Ukraine's position on Transparency International's ranking actually improved. It was one of the few countries in the world. It went up 6 places. And I wonder if you could just sort of, with that backdrop, talk about your perspective as far as the seriousness with which the Ukrainian government has approached this whole question of making sure that this help goes to the right place.
Thank you. I've worked the Ukraine issue now for about 9 years, and in our engagements over that entire period, corruption was the #1 issue we raised with Ukrainian officials. And I think there have been improvements over time, especially in the defense sector, which is obviously most germane for DOD. I will just tell you, in our engagements with senior Ukrainian officials now, I was in Kyiv in January, the secretary talks to his counterpart about every other week. The importance of accountability, of transparency, and of combating corruption are always points of emphasis for us. But it's not just what our talking points say. We have to put, our effort into it. We've provided the Ukrainians with ways to track the systems we provide, to include scanners and software. We've done, when it's safe, remote visits to sites. We don't see any evidence of diversion in our reporting. We think the Ukrainians are using properly what they've been given. But we'll continue to foot stomp the importance of accountability and transparency for all the reasons you mentioned.
And looking again at President Zelensky's own efforts, I would say he courageously took steps to remove officials, some very close even to his office, and political supporters of his own, which shows, I think, tremendous commitment to not just talking about trying to address this problem, but actually taking action to remove people, which again, I think just sort of demonstrates, true commitment. I think, that should be also acknowledged in terms of the seriousness with which, he and his administration is pursuing this goal. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to, as long as we're entering newspaper articles, I'd like to ask that the piece in this morning's Washington Post, Zelensky takes on Ukraine's top internal enemy, be admitted to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And again, that walks through the whole question of how they've improved their score with Transparency International in the midst of dealing with an existential threat to their country. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Connecticut. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing, and thank you all for being here today. General Sims, I'd like to ask you the first question I have. Last week, Vladimir Putin announced the suspension of Russia's participation in the New START treaty. This followed an earlier declaration by the U.S. State Department that Russia was violating the New START treaty. So it appears that Russia has taken New START hostage and is using it to try to get us to stop funding Ukraine. Is the Joint Staff developing plans and options should Russia further violate its limitations in New START? For instance, if it starts uploading its nuclear delivery systems above the caps?
Sure, thank you for the question. So I'll save some fine-tuning on that question for our follow-on session, if that's okay, and certainly pass any of the policy implications to Dr. Kahl to answer. But I would simply say we continue to maintain the strongest nuclear force in the world. We continue to monitor the nuclear situation around the world, to include Russia. And if I was an American, I would not be worried about the nuclear situation.
Very good. And Dr. Kahl, if you could follow up on that, what are some of the diplomatic or other things that the administration is doing in response to Russia's latest stance on New START?
Thanks. It's a really important question. Look, I think as a practical matter, the suspension doesn't make a lot of difference for the reason you mentioned, which is that they were already out of compliance with the inspections regime using COVID and other things as excuses. It's also interesting that Putin decided to suspend as opposed to leave the treaty. And I think that's actually an indication that it's not effective leverage over us. It won't be effective leverage over the Biden administration. Yes, we believe arms control and strategic stability matter for the safety of the American people and for the world. But frankly, Russia is in no position for an unconstrained nuclear arms race. They do not have the money, especially given the strain on their military from the war, sanctions, export controls. So, I think this was a way for him to generate some rhetorical headlines, but I think as a practical matter, it has not changed the situation. Russia remains a dangerous power with a lot of nuclear weapons, and we have to be vigilant against that danger.
Okay, thank you. And I do think it was a mistake for President Biden to re-up New START when he first took office without any discussions at all with the Russians. I think we could have perhaps gotten some concessions or some further understanding, so I think that was a mistake. However, I will compliment the president, and the ranking member will be glad to hear this. I think it was right for him to go to Ukraine recently, and I think that sent the right signal. We all hope and pray to God that there is no use of nuclear weapons by Russia in Ukraine, tactical or anything else. And we don't want to give away what our response would be should that happen, and a lot would depend on the specific circumstances, but what would be some of the consequences to Russia should that unthinkable thing happen?
Thank you for that, and I'm happy to talk about this in greater detail in the classified setting, but what I'll say here is the following. We've made it very clear to Russian leadership at the highest levels through intelligence channels, my boss, Secretary Austin, to his Russian counterpart, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to Gerasimov, our national security advisor to his counterpart in the Kremlin, that any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine on any scale would be considered a world-changing event that would bring about severe consequences far in excess to anything the Russians have experienced to date, and that a lot of the restraints we've been operating under would no longer obtain in a world where Russia crossed that threshold. But the good news is I don't think they're likely to do so.
Yeah, and what they have to lose would be far more than what they would have to gain. And lastly, General Sims, Russia has made some, I think, exaggerated claims that it has used hypersonic weapons in Ukraine, just as they exaggerate a lot of things about their capabilities. Can you shed any further light on that particular question?
Sir, we know they've employed advanced conventional munitions. I wouldn't go into detail here in this session on the particulars. I would tell you that they're doing so at great expense. I mean, they're finding now that their weapons of all types are in dire straits in many cases. And I think what they're also seeing is that the Ukrainians have been very prepared for many of their weapons and are shooting down their weapons at a very high rate.
Very good. Thank you again for being here, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the work that you're personally doing in reaching out and trying to make sure that the supplies are getting to where they need to go, particularly the journey that you took 2 weeks ago to Greece, Romania, and Poland. My question first goes to you, Mr. Storch. Thank you for your detailed explanation of the various projects that you have underway, you and your colleagues have underway. I'd like you to very briefly, or as whatever necessary, summarize the reports that you have provided over the last year and a half. There seems to be two different pieces to that, one of which you have already talked to, and that is suggested improvements in the auditing, in the transfer of weapons and the like. And if you'd like to go into that a little more. And secondly, if you would summarize the findings of those reports, following up on the question earlier about what you actually found.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for the question. As you say, the reports that we've issued to date over the past year since the 2022 invasion really have fallen largely into two categories. A couple of them have looked at issues that we identified relating to the way in which the money that was appropriated is being tracked and the way in which it is being entered into the systems. And so the concerns there are that if there aren't additional improvements, that those could result in a lack of transparency or impair the transparency of those funds. So the department has been making progress in those areas. We've continued to look at that. And as I mentioned, we've recently initiated an audit that's looking at the actual execution of the funds appropriated. So that's sort of an ongoing priority, is how's the money being spent. We did identify issues with the systems and with the procedures in place, made recommendations to help to address.
Let's be clear then, is the department following on your recommendations and making progress to achieve the goals that you've stated?
So, yes, sir. The first management advisory didn't actually have specific recommendations. It raised a number of concerns. The second one did have one recommendation, and that related to putting in place procedures that were more robust in ensuring things were tracked properly. The department has made progress in that area. The recommendation remains open. We're continuing to track it, and then we'll continue to look at that in the course of the ongoing audit.
And so you continue to look for perfection, as you should.
Absolutely, sir.
The second thing, findings that you, beyond the recommendations for the procedures, the findings, did you find any indication that there was a diversion of equipment of any kind?
Again, the second set of projects that we've released or evaluations looking at the controls that DoD has over this end-use monitoring and enhanced end-use monitoring. Once the weaponry goes into Ukraine, there needs to be appropriate accountability and tracking, and so the DoD has responsibilities to do that. So in the first of those reports, we did make a number of findings and recommendations. Most of those have been addressed and the recs have been closed. There are a couple that are outstanding relating to night vision goggles and steps that are being taken. The department has made progress in those areas, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at the current state of that in connection with the newly announced EEUM evaluation that I mentioned. So there's been progress, and that's an ongoing process.
Very good, and I would just comment quickly. I'm very pleased that you're setting up a very robust operation in Ukraine itself, that you're reestablishing within the embassy the various auditing groups necessary to carry it out. Is that the case?
Well, what we have done, sir, is we've forward deployed a significant number of people into the region to do oversight over the supply and training mission, most of which occurs before any weaponry crosses into Ukraine. Then, using some of the same techniques, frankly, we used during, and not just my office, but across the IG community during the COVID pandemic, we're doing additional monitoring relating to the EUM and EEUM and getting information from the military personnel who are at the embassy regarding what's currently being done. If we need to go further and go in, we will, but at this point, we have it covered.
Good, thank you very much. Bottom line is that the programs are working, that the diversions are not happening, and the equipment's getting where it needs to go. Is that it?
We're doing oversight to make sure the department has placed all the controls it needs to make sure that happens, sir.
Didn't quite get to what I'm talking about. You've not found problems of any great significance. Is that correct?
Right. Well, again, a lot of these audits and evaluations are pending, but with regard to the areas I've mentioned, we had limited findings. The department has been addressing them, and we're going to continue to look at the issues. So, yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. We look at the gains that Ukraine has made with assistance from around the world and what's happening to Russian forces. Degraded presence, about 40% of its pre-war fleet of tanks gone, and today 97% of the Russian army is in Ukraine. And even with that, they're struggling. The issue is, for us, the munitions that we're providing to Ukraine. In last year's NDAA, we provided both funding and contracting tools to accelerate replenishing our munition stockpiles, essentially our weapons magazines. I want to talk, though, about where I think there's a strategic mismatch. We give those contracting tools, yet how we evaluate where the needs are, to me, is in contradiction to that. The needs are supposed to be evaluated on the threats in Europe. What's that threat scenario? And as we see, the DOD has up to 2 years to determine that threat scenario. So if we're looking at the scenario 2 years down the road and whatever is happening at that time in Europe, and we are today accelerating the replenishing of our munition stockpile, to me there's a mismatch, because giving 2 years to determine what the needs are, what the threats are, and we're spinning up today to build weapon stockpiles that may be mismatched with what we see 2 years from now, doesn't seem to me to be a good policy. So, Dr. Kahl, can you tell us, based on our force structure requirements on both munitions and ground forces in Europe, how do we make sure that we are making the right determinations about what to build today so we don't have, again, a mismatch? I mean, we're talking about weapons magazines being depleted today, but if we're building weapons that may not have a role in where we need to be 2 years from now, how do we correct that mismatch?
Yes, thank you. It's a very important question. So obviously we've made significant investments because of the money that Congress has generously given us and the authorities to spend it over longer periods of time to recapitalize our munitions. That means increasing production, but it also means addressing supply chain bottlenecks and creating a longer-term demand so that industry is actually responsive. I think what the Ukraine conflict showed is that, frankly, our defense industrial base was not at the level that we needed it to be to generate munitions. So right now, our priorities are making sure that we are increasing production for the things that we anticipate that Ukraine will continue to need. So a good example is 155 millimeter ammunition for the NATO standard howitzers, but also the guided multiple launch rocket systems, the GIMLRs that launch off the HIMARS systems. Those are going to matter a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, because even if the conflict in Ukraine dies down, and nobody can predict whether that'll happen, Ukraine is going to need a military that can defend the territory it's clawed back and deter the Russians from doing this again. The other investments we're doing, of course, are to replenish our own stocks. And they are actually, I think we're relatively confident we're making the investments that we need not only for Russia contingencies, but also for contingencies vis-a-vis China, North Korea, Iran, et cetera. But beyond that, we can go into some of the specific details in the classified setting, if you'd like, in terms of how we're making targeted investments.
Well, that leads me to the next question. The allocations that we're making today to Ukraine are based on a pre-Ukraine Russian conflict scenario. So if we are holding back those munitions based on that scenario, then are we inadvertently holding back the things that Ukraine may need based on what would be an antiquated scenario? So that I think is a question. And then also, How are the determinations made about what we are doing to replenish our stockpiles and what we're sending to Ukraine? How is that interacting with our needs in the Indo-PACOM?
Yeah, so actually, it's a very important point. So we have a total munitions requirement that is essentially a metric against which we need munitions for a whole range of contingencies. So they are not pegged to any one contingency. It's a pool of munitions we could draw on from a range of different scenarios. We have adjusted that floor to account for the fact that Russia is bogged down in Ukraine. Their land forces have been badly attrited. It has changed the dynamic for a future Russia contingency. At the same time, we have requirements for operational plans in other parts of the world, could be North Korea, Iran, China, et cetera. And so Secretary Austin has been laser focused on making sure that as we draw down from our own stocks, we are getting Ukraine what it needs without taking undue risk to those other plans. And I think we have so far accomplished that. But we also need to recapitalize so that we can build up that hedge in the event that something bad happens elsewhere in the world.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Chair, now you recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and certainly appreciate the ongoing insight and the most recent visit to the region. The amazing thing that the United States does better than anybody in the world, hands down, is the logistics, the ability to move men, equipment, resources is short of remarkable. I just want to touch base, Chairman of TAL, Mr. Whitman. 3 years ago, there were some disturbing reports on the industrial base issues on our ammo plants, our explosives and accelerants, and we had been very much focused on that. Had we not actually sped up the recapitalization, I think we would be even in worse place, but we still have quite a ways to go. My question goes to Dr. Kahl and the General. Putin leaves no chance when he speaks to the people of not only his country but the world, but to imply the nuclear option over and over again. And it finds an audience in the United States. People are worried about what might happen. We've seen time and time again, there's a discussion about the red lines and what they are. And if we go back a year, what a red line was then certainly may or may not be the red line of today. And that's what I want to ask about the evolving or changing red lines. The calculations that we've made, and HIMARS is one of those discussions. Early on, we didn't want to do it. What calculations are going into effect that something that we are providing is or is not going to change the red lines? How do we determine what those red lines are and how have they changed since the beginning? Doctor, if you could go first.
Yeah, it's something we watch very closely, I think for all the reasons that you've mentioned. Clearly, Putin's rhetoric from the very outset of the war on nuclear matters has been irresponsible and dangerous. We've attempted not to take the bait while in private, making it clear to them that if they were to cross certain lines of using nuclear weapons on any scale, what a world-changing event that would be. As a general matter, I do not think that we are holding back security assistance from Ukraine at the moment, largely for escalatory reasons. I think most of the decisions we are making on security assistance are driven first and foremost by our assessment of what Ukraine needs right now, given the amount of money that the American taxpayer has given the department to work with. How do we use that money for what they need right now? And then the other is, what can we provide that doesn't have huge impacts on our own readiness and our ability to respond to our own national security crises in other parts of the world. So really, those are the two things that we are measuring against. I think at the moment we feel relatively comfortable on where we are on the escalatory dynamic vis-a-vis Russia, but it's something that we consult with our intelligence community colleagues constantly to make sure we're setting the rheostat, about right without self-deterring ourselves.
Thank you. So, General, when we started a year ago, there's been much discussion from the committee and those in Congress about what we're able to send to them. How much of an impact has that, quote, red line been, and has it changed since a year ago?
So I would tell you what we've sent over the last year has made a gigantic difference to the Ukrainians. If you start where we were last year at the onset, it was about providing things at the moment that they needed. They were javelins, they were Stinger missiles. They were things that they needed to defeat the Russian army as they came across the border around the country. Those things were provided in good order. They were used extremely well by the Ukrainians. As the conditions changed, so too did the requests from the Ukrainians in terms of what they thought was necessary. And as we talked with our Ukrainian counterparts, what we thought would be most advantageous and available to them, all the while, as Dr. Kahl mentioned earlier, balancing it against our current readiness and our ability to meet any requirements around the world. Those have certainly morphed over time. And so as you've seen, sir, now the provision of Bradley fighting vehicles, of tanks, and our partners make these same assertions. They've all been done with these things in mind. And I feel very confident that as we go forward, we'll continue to do so and make decisions in a very thoughtful and understanding manner.
Exactly my point, that we are not holding back because of these red lines or nuclear threats. These are actual determinations made by what's best for the Ukrainians and their use at any time. With that, I yield back. Thanks.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the panel being here for this timely hearing on the oversight of U.S. military support to Ukraine. Mr. Storch, can you tell us roughly how much money has been given total to the Ukrainian war effort since we began last year?
Well, it depends a little bit how you count it, but I believe it's over $113 billion approximately.
How much is that for lethal aid or what we'd consider standard military equipment?
I'm afraid I don't have that number at my fingertips.
So not a breakdown, roughly 60-40, 20-80 in terms of what's going to the government, what's going to military aid?
There's security assistance, there's economic assistance, there's humanitarian assistance. The numbers are in the JSOP, but it's approximately, I think, a little over 60% of it is the military assistance.
Okay, and I ask this question because whether our constituencies back home are for or against this war, they don't have the benefit of the hearings that we have, the classified briefings that we have, and so we want to know that we can tell the taxpayers that our money is being spent wisely. And this hearing today is coming on the heels of a CIGAR report released this week titled "Why the Afghan Security Forces Collapsed," in which the Special Inspector General reports, among other things, that rampant corruption gradually eroded the capabilities of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, as well as the legitimacy of the Afghan government. So we need to make sure we don't make those same mistakes in Ukraine. And a month ago, John Kirby claimed from the administration that he has not seen any signs so far that our budgetary assistance has fallen prey to any kind of corruption. Would you agree with that statement?
So on the issue of corruption, one of the reasons we do all these reviews is to ensure the integrity of the systems in place and that controls are there so to help to prevent it from corruption. And then, as I mentioned, we have DCIS that's there to investigate any allegations that might arise. With regard to the Afghanistan report, I'd just say I'm aware that's been issued. Our folks are looking at that. But it's obviously a very different situation in Ukraine, very different mission. In Ukraine, there aren't large numbers of troops on the ground. It's not building the military from the ground up. It's primarily a train and supply mission, something our office is very well equipped to oversee.
Right. And the Inspector General went on to say in his report that the United States played into the hands of political leaders and contributed to their corruption by spending money faster than it can be accounted for. So I think when we say we've spent roughly $100 billion, we ought to break that down and have a clear message from DOD, and we've had hearings where we've suggested that to keep the public on board. I understand what the strategy is and what the benefit is, but we want to make sure the people back home get this. And it didn't help. Last year, for example, in a briefing, unnamed senior official said that there was about 100 kamikaze switchblade drones provided to Ukraine, that they couldn't tell where they were, who was using them, and didn't know if they'd ever know exactly where they come from or where they would be used at. And so those type of statements aren't helpful. But I think that you'd mentioned earlier that we have a proven model, and maybe you can elaborate and make us feel a little bit better that this proven model that you're referencing has worked somewhere else, and that we're accounting for the equipment that we're sending.
Yes, sir, absolutely. We do have a proven model, I believe, using the lead IG model that's been used in overseas contingency operations, showing how we can work together as an oversight community to provide comprehensive oversight. So we currently are engaged, for instance, on oversight over the Operation Enduring Sentinel mission, the over-the-horizon counterterrorism mission that's followed on in Afghanistan. And we have a number of projects at DoD, OIG related to that. We're also coordinating with our partners. We report out quarterly in public reports on our work in that area. It's obviously an area where we've done a lot of other work as well. But the point of it is, with Ukraine, we have not just the three of us, but actually 20 different oversight entities, including GAO, including all the military audit agencies, and all the rest working together to ensure that there aren't any gaps, that we're covering the waterfront and all types of assistance, security, economic, humanitarian, other assistance, that we're doing oversight over all of it, so the American public knows that the taxpayer dollars are being spent.
Is there a specific example, like loss reports is due within a specific time, say 30 days, or a condition that they give us 100% accuracy on inventory, or is there anything in place that would make more clarity? Because it seems like we all say that this is accounted for, but yet there's a lot of disparity when we ask for specific examples of how we know this equipment's accounted for.
So we're doing a robust series of oversight projects to ensure the accountability of equipment from the very beginning until it gets into Ukraine. And then once it's in Ukraine, we're doing continued work in that critical area I mentioned.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Carbajal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. We recently marked the one-year anniversary of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. During that year, the United States and many other nations have stepped up to provide aid. The United States has provided approximately $30 billion in security assistance. That has been instrumental in allowing Ukraine to keep fighting. It is important we conduct thorough oversight of taxpayer dollars going to this cause, and I think we have been doing just that. Dr. Kahl, we want the war to end quickly and on Ukraine's terms. You stated in your testimony that our goal is to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position for future negotiations. Within the 5-year near-term focus areas, how is the department working with industry to maximize production in support of Ukraine and in backfilling our defense stocks that have been leveraged to date?